which led to the formulation and the confirmation of the hypothesis, the expectation fulfillment theory of dreams. Dreams are pattern matches to waking expectations, stuff that we were thinking about or concerned about whilst we were awake. It is waking conscious experiences are pattern matched in dreams. Not all expectations form dreams. It's expectations that cause emotional arousal that we do not act out or express to become dreams. And what do dreams do? Well, they deactivate that emotional arousal, which frees the brain to respond afresh to each new day. Now, in the 20 years since that hypothesis was formulated and published, every significant piece of dream research that has carried out since then, making additional discoveries about dreaming, has substantiated the theory. There has been no significant piece of research that has disconfirmed the theory. In 20 years, this has stood and not in any way been damaged by subsequent discoveries in sleep research or science. Indeed, they have generated a mounting evidence confirming the hypothesis. Interestingly, if we now think about, other species dreaming, if we think about, or at least in REM sleep, and if we think about the baby, the fetus in its mother's womb, how do we link this up with dreaming? Well, if we go back to Juve's hypothesis that the baby in the womb is being programmed with instinctive templates, then the purpose of dreaming is twofold. It is to preserve the integrity of the emotional instincts that have been programmed. You see, by not acting them out during the daytime, we are placing inhibitions upon our emotional instincts. And by releasing those inhibitions through the dream, we are preserving the integrity. So remember, Juve formulated two hypotheses as to what dreaming might be about. It might be deleting damage or adding new knowledge in. We now know it's actually deleting damage to the genetic templates. Now we know from what I've said that our instincts have to be programmed as patterns seeking to be pattern matched in the environment. So the whole language of programming instincts is necessarily pattern matching or metaphorical. And that is one explanation for why our dreams are a metaphor, because the language of the REM state is pattern matching or metaphor. However, when I first circulated this theory to some eminent scientists in sleep research, they felt unconvinced by the theory, because they said, oh, it all sounds very good, but I'm not convinced by the pattern matching aspect to it, because they argued, well, okay, well, maybe the REM state is about pattern matching, but there must be a good reason to keep the pattern matching in place for dreaming, because it's taking up energy doing that pattern matching. Why not just act out the suppressed impulse? And that was a very good point. Okay, the language of the unconscious is metaphorical or pattern matching, but why keep it in place for dreaming? Why not just let it go? Because it obviously takes a certain amount of data processing to find these patterns. Wouldn't it be simpler just to let the original impulse be acted out? And it took me some years before I could see why it had to be in patterns. Why the pattern matching process had to be preserved. So in order to keep our memory system intact, it is essential that we dream in metaphor. We would go insane if we didn't. Right, in this next section, I'm going to take a look at some of the more well-known alternative theories of dreaming, and I'll take some questions and answers on the floor as well. So we've already explored why it is that you have to dream in metaphor or pattern matching. I want to go on now to consider the major theories that are at play as alternative explanations for dreaming. The theory that has held the widest sway and the greatest acceptance among scientists for several decades is a theory called the activation synthesis theory, which was put forward by a chap called Alan Hobson. Initially, he had a partner called McCarley as well, but he's the one who's continued with the theory and researched and written an awful lot about it, Alan Hobson, Harvard University. Now, his theory is that since dreaming occurs in REM sleep on a regular basis, this must serve a biological function in the brain. And since the dreaming is initiated and triggered off by a cascade of electrical signals coming up from the brainstem to the cortex, he decided that the function of dreaming was to wake the cortex up, to activate it every so often, and that random barrage of electrical signals hitting the cortex, that the cortex then tries to make sense of it, and it synthesizes that random barrage of signals, and the resulting effect is our dreams. And the reason our dreams, he argued, are so bizarre and ridiculous is the brain is trying to make sense of something that is inherently nonsensical, namely a random barrage of signals coming at it. The advantage of this, of course, is that, that it keeps the brain tuned up in case we need to wake up suddenly and deal with stuff. It keeps the brain primed with this stimulation every so often happening. Now, scientists love that theory, mainly because it was so simple. And you didn't have to worry about what dreams were. You didn't have to think about whether it's symbolical or metaphorical. It was a very, very simple theory. Unfortunately, it's dead wrong. Now, there's a whole swaths of evidence that I could give you to prove that it's wrong. But here are some things. If you have read the work that I published and that I published with Ivan on dreaming, you will see the huge amount of evidence that we published showing that dreams are metaphors. Hobson would argue ferociously, dreams are not metaphors. They are just random synthesizing of random stimuli. He would argue ferociously that there's no sense to dreams, no real sense, no real pattern to them. So it doesn't explain why dreams are metaphors. It doesn't explain why if you wake a person part way through a dream and they go back to sleep, they will complete the dream. There's a need in the brain to complete the pattern of the dream. But since his hypothesis is essentially that dreams are the result of random activation, there should be no need to complete the pattern. That counts against his theory. But perhaps more than anything that really blows his theory out of the water is that the research done on the brain during REM sleep. Research done on the brain shows that the parts of the brain that are activated is not a general activation of the cortex, but an activation of very specific parts of the brain that's involved in REM sleep. There's an activation of obviously the geniculate in the thalamus. There's an activation of the amygdala. There's an activation of the occipital cortex, which is used for generating imagery. And there's an activation of the emotional expectation circuit in the brain. So it's specifically the emotional expectation circuit in the brain that's activated by this random barrage, plus the part of the brain involved in generating images. It is not the cortex, as he believed, that was being stimulated. It's specific parts of the brain. And that essentially blows the theory out of the water.
He also abandoned the theory, didn't he?
Sorry?
He has recently abandoned his theory.
Well, I hesitate to say that because, he has talked more about other theories, but he hasn't actually formally withdrawn it. Now, there's another theory that's been getting a bit of airspace in recent times, and page space, and that's a theory by a psychoanalyst and sleep researcher by the name of Professor Solms. And essentially, what he's seeking to do is to use the evidence of the activation of the emotional centers and the expectation centers in the brain to see that as a validation of Freud's theory. Now, Freud's theory had been hugely neglected, but he's seeking to bring it back into prominence because he's saying clearly the brain is the emotional circuits that are predominantly being activated in dreaming. So therefore, this really confirms Freud's theory. And Freud's theory, in a way, was half right, because Freud believed dreams were wish fulfillments. Wishes are a subset of expectations. So some expectations can be wishes. So to some degree, Freud's theory was right. And he's certainly right in the idea that it's about emotions. So yeah, this is a partial confirmation of Freud's hypothesis that dreaming involves emotions. However, the circuits that are activated in the brain are far better described as the emotional expectation circuits. So the expectation theory of dreaming is a much better fit for the physiological data. And that is to ignore completely all the other evidence we've published, how dreams are pattern matches to waking, emotional arousing expectations, etc., etc. Another hypothesis that gets some airplay these days is the memory consolidation theory, although that again is falling into a huge amount of this confirmatory evidence. The idea was that dreams help to consolidate memory. And, for example, there were scientists in Israel who published data showing that after mice or rats ran around mazes, that in REM sleep, the very same circuits in the hippocampus were activated, which tracks patterns in space, as well as our personal memory. We're activated in REM sleep as we're activated whilst we were awake. And that seemed to suggest that maybe dreaming and REM sleep have something got to do with memory. However, the evidence that this confirms that hypothesis is huge. For a start, think about the millions of people who have taken antidepressants. Antidepressants, particularly the older ones, older versions, completely suppressed dreaming. And so all these people who were on antidepressants should have found that their memories were being destroyed. They weren't developing any new memories. But in fact, the contrary is true. When they're put on antidepressants, they're more likely to remember stuff rather than not remember it. So, I mean, and the amount of evidence there is so huge that it really just blows that theory out of the water. However, and further additional researchers have shown that REM sleep is particularly consolidated, or rather memory is particularly consolidated during non-REM sleep. And indeed, the activation of place cells in the hippocampus takes place far more in non-REM sleep than it does in REM sleep. So I think we can safely leave that hypothesis alone. However, though, the expectation theory of dreaming would predict that REM sleep could provide some improvement in memory, given this fact, that if you're learning something, you're bound to make a number of false starts and not get it exactly right. So that if we then go into REM sleep and dream, the false starts, the expectations that weren't confirmed, will then be switched off by dreaming, which will leave the particular circuits that were active free to be consolidated. So we would predict that there will be some improvement in memory as a result of REM sleep. So the fact that there could be an improvement in memory in no way invalidates the expectation fulfillment theory of dreaming. So we can leave that safely alone, I think, that hypothesis. Another theory that is getting more attention now than it did a couple of decades ago, because so many of the theories are falling by the wayside, as it were, is a theory put forward by a Finnish scientist by the name of Rivan Suo. And his theory is the threat simulation theory. Because the amygdala is more activated in REM sleep than when REM sleep is not taking place, and fight or flight is more activated, he put forward the hypothesis that dreaming and REM sleep is for the purpose of rehearsing how to deal with threats. So that theory gets a bit of attention nowadays. And there's an element of truth in it. Of course, the fight or flight mechanism is more activated in REM sleep because it is about emotional activation that's not acted out. So we would predict that the fight or flight mechanism and the amygdala will be much more active in REM sleep. That is something we would expect from the expectation theory of dreaming. And of course, a certain amount of dreaming might be about threats, because if we're expecting a threat and it doesn't manifest, well then of course we'll have a dream about it. But anybody who looks at a significant corpus of dreaming from any individual will see that they have loads of dreams that are not about rehearsing strategies for dealing with threat. They have loads of dreams, some of them are happy dreams, some of them are sexual dreams, about all kinds of things. Although a proportion of them will be about threat. But even those dreams, very often the strategy implied will be counterproductive. For example, I once dreamt that I was killed in that isn't exactly a native survival, dreaming you're killed, is it? I mean, that's not rehearsing a survival strategy, is it? Getting yourself shot and killed. So an awful lot of dreams are clearly much more complex and they're much more metaphorical, and the simple notion that they exist to rehearse survival strategies is really not compatible with the wider field of evidence.